let's now look at, if we begin in terms of contextualizing our topic today by looking at the wider market in Germany to begin with, and two aspects: the major cities. There are five across which everybody, I'm sure, knows, will be aware of these cities. I might ask a little bit more detail in the subsequent slide about these cities, but from the moment we can see them there: Berlin, the capital city, Frankfurt, Munich, Dusseldorf, and Hamburg as well. Looking at the German office lease terms, I'm fascinated to see over 4 webinars that we've had. We started with the one in London. That's the kind of landlord and tenant system I'm currently familiar with. I trained up in the Dublin system. Each system, the Paris system, has its own differences. So I always find it really interesting to see how the different systems compare to each other. And just looking at the German office lease terms, there's reference to the German Civil Code, obviously directed from the government. Commercial leases are interestingly less regulated than residential leases in Germany. Is there any sense of why that is, Marvin? Is there anything? Is there an obvious reason for that? Do you think?
So I think there's no clear obvious reason, but those are always professional market participants, and if the German state tries to protect especially residential tenants, and so that's why it is more regulated compared to commercial leases. And as you mentioned on the slide, the basis for those leases is the Bürgerliches Gesetzbuch, the German civil code, basically. And all the leases must comply basically with this code. And especially on the residential side, there are some strict restrictions on the rent increasements, for instance, service charge escalation and stuff like that. And especially commercial leases are less regulated, so there's more freedom in setting up the rent and other stuff, which has to be agreed between the parties.
We could probably have a separate. I'm less familiar with residential lettings and leasing in the UK, but we can have a separate webinar, I suspect, in comparing those as well. But
True.
Rent usually quoted per square meter, no surprise there, but payable monthly in advance. Over in the UK, it's normally quarterly in advance on kind of main lettings, but monthly seems to be the norm in Germany, which is interesting to see. Leases normally 5 to 10 years, although they can, in the retail subsector, stretch out longer, and I'm not surprised. This over here, it's quite common that retail tenants, because they build up goodwill associated with the particular location of the unit, they want to stay longer. So I suspect there's something similar happening there in Germany. Maximum lease terms 30 years. Okay, break options can be brought in. They look pretty straightforward. One interesting thing over in the UK. Landlords, if it's a landlord's market and they can dictate the terms of a lease, they will often look for guarantees behind the tenant and perhaps a security deposit. Now, when we looked at the French market last week, there was no tradition of having personal guarantees, the directors behind the company providing personal guarantees. That is something that is looked for on weaker tenants, commercial tenants in the UK, if the landlord has any worries about the tenant paying rent in the future. Is there any sort of safety net type mechanisms in the German market for the landlord if the tenant, if there's a worry about the tenant's ability to pay rent? Do they
So basically, you've got standard stuff like deposits, obviously, and obviously, as you mentioned, if the tenant is weaker, you would try to get a parental guarantee, for instance, and you need to get something to secure the lease, basically, especially for weaker tenants. You also do some checks on them, how's their credit rating, for instance, and that's the usual process, I'd say.
Yeah. Can a security deposit where they put down, it could be 3 to 6 months rent sometimes in
correct.
Is that something that happens in Germany as well?
Yeah, so usually the preference is a bank guarantee, because you don't want to have the cash on the bank account, right? Because you have to pay interest and you need to keep it secure, basically. So the preference is obviously bank guarantee in this case, but cash deposits sometimes also happen, but I guess also preferably for smaller tenants, I'd say.